All right, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you so much to Peter and the Data Institute for hosting this event. So this project is joint with my co-author Liz Lyons at UCSD. So everyone here knows that digital technology has done a lot in terms of reducing the cost of performing various business functions, right? So a lot of the digital tools that we're familiar with, like Google Ads, Shopify, QuickBooks, Sortly, have done a tremendous job in aggregating demand from across the world, reducing labor and capital requirements, which has been shown to enhance firm productivity. So most of the work on this has been in the context of large enterprises. And to date, there has been very little evidence on how digital technologies are used in the context of small businesses and the types of benefits that they confer to founders. So in this paper, we're going to argue that in addition to the productivity benefits that are conferred to firms, there's also a founder-specific benefit that's conferred to founders. And the reason for this is because in the initial stages of a startup, founders are faced with simultaneous demands on their attention and time. Right. There's a lot of things that they have to do, like securing financing, finding customers, figuring out infrastructure, et cetera. Right? So technology adoption for a small business function, right, for a small business will essentially help save the founders time from performing that activity manually or going on the labor market to hire workers to perform that task. And we might imagine that this founder-specific benefit is going to be particularly consequential when there are constraints on attention, capital, and labor, like in the earlier stages of the startup. And we might further imagine that this is going to be especially salient for female founders that have much higher levels of non-work-related responsibilities like childcare, right, that further limit the amount of time that they have for their businesses. Recent work actually is starting to link that venture survival and performance outcomes is very much associated with sort of the non-work related demands that female founders have. So to the extent that digital technology can help increase the relative efficiency of female founders' work time, there's potentially a lot of benefits from adopting digital technology by female founders. At the same time, however, female founders might also face higher adoption costs. So the research on this is actually quite sparse and mostly in the policy realm, but we might imagine that female founders are going to face higher adoption costs because it's generally sort of accepted that there's lower access to internet access due to cultural norms or societal stereotypes. We might imagine that there are also differences in business knowledge and domains that preclude female founders from adopting specific types of digital technology. To the extent that female firms tend to be smaller, they might be less willing to incur capital expenditure like acquiring digital technology. And finally, we might also expect that digital skills might also differ across male and female founders that would lead female founders to be less likely to adopt digital tools. What we're going to further argue in this paper is that adoption costs are going to vary by technology types, right? So policy reports tend to refer to this grand thing called the digital technology digital gender divide, but they refer to this largely based on this broad category of information communication technologies, which encompasses a multitude of different types of technologies. So overall, it's unclear whether and to what extent female entrepreneurs are differentially likely to adopt different types of technology. So in this paper, we're going to look at three sets of questions. First, we're going to ask, are there actually gender divides in digital tool use amongst entrepreneurs? And if there is one, what might be driving any observed gender disparities in digital tool use? And lastly, we're going to try to link this idea that there's this founder-specific benefit of adopting digital technology by trying to understand whether founders' non-work-related demands correlate with digital tool adoption. So our empirical setting is going to be using this large random representative sample of business owners with Facebook pages, which gives us a nice cross-section of over 20,000 small businesses across 42 different countries. So this data source that we have is Facebook's Future of Business Survey, which is a collaboration that they've done over multiple years now between Facebook, OECD, and the World Bank. The nice thing about this data set, as I said, is it's a random representative of businesses with Facebook pages, and we have a lot of reasons to think that this is representative of small business across these countries. And a lot of most of the respondents here are the firm owners, which gives us confidence evidence that they have sort of the capacity and knowledge to answer questions related to the extent of technology use. The downside of this data, however, is that it's not a panel, and the questions do change survey wave after survey wave, which is why we focus on the 2017 to 2018 cohorts where the questions are the same. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on the data, but essentially our key outcome variables of interest is going to be looking at the extent of digital tool use. We're going to look at two different types of digital tool use. One is what we're going to call external digital tools, which are essentially technologies that are used to connect with external stakeholders. So you can think of any technology that's used to communicate with customers, advertise to them, communicate with suppliers, etc. Our independent variable, our second category of technologies are what we're calling internal digital tools, and these are essentially technologies that are used to manage internal business processes. So think of technologies used to do accounting, to file your taxes, to manage finances, to manage inventory, right? So TurboTax is what I like to think of for internal digital tools. Our independent variables are obviously going to be whether a firm is female-founded, and our measure of non-work-related demands is based on a survey question that asks founders about their primary founding motivation. And if they respond that their primary motivation is to balance work-life objectives, that we infer that to mean that they have a priority for non-work-related, that they have a priority for non-work responsibilities rather than sort of just the pecuniary motivation of starting a business. And we have sort of other ways of verifying this measure that it truly captures non-work related responsibilities rather than, say, just leisure. Okay, so we have a host of rich firm level controls that captures the quality of the firms, the growth orientation of the firms, that what we might think would separately impact digital tool adoption. So the first thing that we're going to look at is looking at the patterns of digital tool use across these 42 countries. And what we found is that we do document a digital gender gap, but it's actually concentrated in the use of internal digital tools. Okay, so the left-hand side graph here is plotting the external digital tool use across these 42 countries. The y-axis is the extent of use by male founders, the x-axis is the extent of use by female founders, and the right-hand side panel is for internal digital tools. And what we can see here is on the left-hand side, most of the countries are clustered along that 45-degree line, which suggests that male and female founders use the external digital tools, so think marketing tools, at the same rate, whereas for most countries in our sample, female founders are significantly less likely to use internal digital tools, think accounting tools, than their male founders. In fact, there's no country in our sample where female founders are more likely to use internal digital tools than their male counterparts. What's interesting here is that we find this pattern holds across almost every country in our sample, including ones that are considered relatively gender equal along most of the key socioeconomic metrics that we care about. Okay. The second thing that we do is, so now that we've documented that this pattern, what might be some of the reasons that's causing this gender gap, right? So we're limited in the amount of things that we can do to try to explain this, but we would consider a bunch of potential explanations that might be driving this internal digital gender gap. What we find is that first of all, we don't have evidence that these gender differences is due to internet access, which is the primary explanation of policy experts, because every firm in our sample has access to the internet because they have a Facebook page, and we see that gap is the same magnitude across countries that are gender equal and not gender equal. We also don't find evidence that it's due to gender differences in founders' business knowledge. So if you're concerned that female founders are more likely to have education or work backgrounds in marketing compared to finance, and that's what's driving their lower likelihood of adopting internal digital tools, we don't find evidence for that. We also don't find evidence that it's due to differences in firm characteristics, right? So if the idea is, if your concern is that female founders are more likely to start firms like Etsy, for instance, that displays low scalability and low growth orientation, we don't find this to be the case. So we proxy for growth orientation using a multitude of metrics, and we find the magnitude of that internal digital tool gap to be persistent across all of them. What we do find evidence for is that is digital skills. That's the explanation that we do find evidence for. Female entrepreneurs, we find that female entrepreneurs in countries with a lower share of ICT degrees are the ones that are less likely to use internal digital tools. The third set of things that we do is looking at this relationship between digital tool use and work-life balance, right? So the non-work-related demands. And what we find is that female firms that are founded for work-life balance use external digital tools to a much greater extent compared to the male counterparts that also start firms for work-life balance and their female counterparts who do not start firms for work-life balance. In other words, compared to the two other groups that have conceivably lower non-work-related demands. What's interesting here is that we don't find male entrepreneurs' extent of digital tool use to be related to whether they start firms for work-life balance at all, and we find similar but less stark patterns for internal digital tool use, which is arguably associated with higher adoption cost. The last piece of findings that I'll show you is that we find that this relationship between work-life balance, female-founded firms, and digital tool use is really driven by firms started in countries that have a much higher level of domestic responsibilities. So we take advantage of a survey question that asks founders the number of hours that they spend on housework and childcare, and we use that to construct measures of countries that have high versus low levels of household responsibilities. And we find that the previous pattern that I just showed you, this tendency of women to adopt digital tools who start firms for work-life balance, is really just primarily driven by the women who start firms in these high household responsibility countries. So that is the paper in a nutshell. So we find that there is a digital gender gap, but it's not uniform across technology types. And this founder-specific benefit of digital technology is particularly salient for female founders that faced heightened non-work-related constraints, and we find that pattern is particularly pronounced for the use of external digital tools that arguably have fewer adoption barriers. What's interesting here is that non-work-related responsibility is generally viewed as a large contributor to inequality in the broader labor market, but we think it really sort of also increases the potential returns for female founders in adopting digital tools, which suggests that, if we think about interventions that really sort of reduce the cost of adopting these types of tools can be potentially important as firms scale, because they help with internal resource allocation of the firm and can impact survival and have performance implications for female founders. Thanks.
Just one question. Does this depend on the education background of the founder rather than the gender? That's one question. Second is that the type of business as well, because most of the business starting now use digital tools. That's the reason I'm asking.
Yeah, so just maybe a clarification. So the gap is just for internal digital tools, right? It's not for the use of, say, marketing tools. We don't have questions on education background, but the way we try to look at whether educational background or just differences in founding industry is driving this is we look at industries that have high versus low requirement for internal tools. So essentially, you have to have a baseline knowledge of use of these tools to get into the industry. And again, we sort of see the same results. Yeah.
Were there also differences did you measure the size of the company? In other words, were the women starting smaller businesses and had less need for the internal tools?
Yeah, no, that's one of the first things sort of we considered as well. We do look at firm size. So on average, it is true that the female firms tend to be smaller, employ fewer people than the male counterparts. But even for firms that are larger, the female firms are much less likely to adopt internal tools.
Well, thanks again, Laurina. Wonderful.